Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Let me introduce tonight's session, which is on sustainability, citizenship, and the environment. And this is session number 6 that we've had in this series on global citizenship. And a very warm welcome to all of you, and thanks very much indeed for joining us. This whole series has been put together by 3 people in particular, and I'd like to, in particular, recognise them. There's Michael Armenian from the Zamin Group, who really is the inspirer and the founder behind this whole programme. Sir Mark Moody-Stewart in front of me here, who's the chairman of Zamin, and also Mark O'Daniel here at Tate Modern, who have been the 3 key people who have really been instrumental in putting, I think, this original programme together around global citizenship. And we've had 5 partner organisations which have been, if you like, supporting this event. Tate Modern itself, SOAS, the African Progress Panel, Barclays, and Accenture. And before we start, I'd just like to sort of ask you as an audience, who's actually here for the first time? So actually quite a lot of you, probably something like 50% of you. So what I'd like to encourage you is that all the sessions so far have been recorded, and there's a website called thezaminforum.org. And if you want to go back and look at some of the sessions that have been presented beforehand, then go to that website and you'll see some really interesting video clips around the previous sessions. And obviously in the booklet are the previous 6 sessions. There are 2 more in this series to come. There's one tomorrow, which I think is going to be very interesting, looking at the whole question about what happens after the G8 meeting. There's Ian Bremner, who's got a particular sort of view about G0. So that's the focus for the session tomorrow. And then on Wednesday, our closing session is going to be looking at what are some of the key lessons that have come out of global citizenship and the various lectures that we've had around the lessons for G8. And so if you can't come in person, then what I'd really like to encourage you to do is to look at some of those sort of key messages and see what I think are some of the key and interesting insights that come out of it. Now, as far as tonight's concerned, I'm very pleased that we've got 2 guests here with me tonight. Paul Polman, who is the Chief Executive of Unilever, and I'll talk a bit more about Unilever in a second as part of the introduction, and Faisal Islam, who many of you will recognise as Channel 4's economics editor. Channel 4 have worked extremely closely with us. We've also been talking to John Snow. John, in fact, was hoping to be here, but he's actually out in Tehran to cover the Iranian election. So he's not here, but he's here in spirit. And in terms of the format for tonight, what we'd like to do is I'd like to try and set the scene for you. And then Paul is going to give a keynote lecture, really looking about sustainability through his lens and through his eyes as one of the role models, I think, in the business world around sustainability. We'll have a bit of a discussion up here around some of the themes that have come out. And then in the second hour, we're very much keen to have an audience participation, so dialogue with you and talk with you. But let me just try and sort of set the scene and just provide some context around sustainability, citizenship and the environment. And there couldn't really be a more interesting theme than sustainability when you look at it from the point of view of both global and local, because sustainability in the environment transcends national boundaries. And so what makes this particularly interesting is that when you're talking about being a citizen of the world, there are some very real issues about how does that impact us as individual sort of citizens. And what I want to suggest is, as we set the scene, is that there are some very important issues which operate at the level of policy making, both internationally and nationally. Very important in terms of the role of multiple stakeholders, business, for example, and civil society. But we also have a very key role around sustainability when we look at it individually, because we are all consumers and we're all citizens together. But I wonder what you sort of think of when you sort of use the word sustainability. And what I'd like to suggest to you is that sustainability is really about thinking about the way that we live and work. But it's actually thinking about how we work and how we live in the context of our economic, our environmental, and our social impact. And so as we talk about sustainability, think about those sorts of roots. It's about the way that we're going to work and live. And if I was to crystallize that out a little bit more in a global context, there's 7 billion people in the world today. There's 8 billion people in the world in 2027. And there's more than 9 billion people in the world in 2050. And the key challenge for all of us is how are we going to live and work together in a way that provides people with the right sorts of health, the right sort of education, the right sort of shelter, the right sort of food, and the right sorts of mobility, the basic standards of living that people would expect. So I'm very keen that as we think about sustainability, it's partly about where we've come from, but a lot of it is about where we're going to. And yes, the sustainability road has been a difficult journey. You can go back to 72. To the Stockholm Declaration. You can look at what happened with the Earth Summit in 92. You can look at what happened last year around Rio +20. There are some very major challenges out there. And perhaps at the biggest level, the big macro challenges is where are we in terms of planetary boundaries? And if you go and talk to most of the scientists today, if you look at some of the models that are out there, we talk about 2 degrees warming, but the reality is that we're probably closer to a path which is taking us towards 4 degrees. How do we feel about that? What does that sort of mean? Where are the tipping points? We don't really know. And then we can look at some of the other sort of factors. And we look at, for example, the 1.3 billion people today that haven't got access to electricity. And the predictions are it's still going to be 1.3 billion people without electricity in 2030. Because as the population grows between now and 2030, even with the rate at which electricity and energy is getting improved, that is not going to reduce the numbers of people without electricity. And we could look at the other statistics that exist out there in terms of the number of people who haven't got access to clean water or access to sanitation. But I think it's very important to say it's not all black. There are some good news. It's not always great news. It's very mixed signals. But if you look at the Millennium Development Goals and the progress that we've made, actually, the amount of extreme poverty has come down in the last 20 years. Might not have come down enough, but it has been sort of coming down. We have made progress on things like vaccine. But there are some still very real challenges that we face. So, for example, we know that hunger is still a major problem. The children's, if you like, lives are being stunted by failure to sort of provide sufficient access to food. And we know that the number of slums is growing and the number of people living in slums has continued to increase. So the thing is that today, it's a very sort of mixed world, mixed messages. But let's try and look forward. Think about what are some of the big drivers that are going on in terms of the world and where it sort of stands today. And some of the drivers are economic. We are in an economically interdependent world, and yet in many ways the politics of the world has become very local. Just look at what happened with the American election. 9 states basically drove the outcome of the US election. Economic interdependence, politically very local. 6 billion people today, though, 6 billion people have access to mobile technology. It's interesting, I was looking at a country like Bangladesh. 148 million people in Bangladesh. 100 million of them have access to a mobile phone. That's in Bangladesh. Kenya, 28 million people have access to a phone out of 42 million. So it's not all bad. Economic, political, demographic, technology. These drivers are playing through together in terms of impacting the world in which we live. Economic interdependence, political localism, demographics in terms of the growth of cities, technology which is empowering particularly the ordinary citizen, not just in the West, but also in many emerging markets. But the real challenge with sustainability is that a lot of the benefits that come are general, but the pain points are specific. And one of the questions I think we need to get into as we talk about sustainability is who wins and who loses? Where are the gains and where are the losses? And when you actually look forward, there are actually, I think, quite a lot of directional indicators as to what needs to be done. We know that it's very important that we have economic development, particularly for women. We know that there are issues about the costs of externalities, carbon, water, and ecosystems. We know that we have to reduce greenhouse gases. We know that we need more low-carbon energy. We need more low-carbon mobility. We need to fundamentally improve our use of resources, probably by something like 4 to 10-fold over the course of the next 30 to 40 years. We know also that we need to halve deforestation. We know that we need to double agricultural output without increasing the land. These things we know. The question is, how do we bring all of those together? And what I would suggest to you is that what we need to do is we need to have the politicians out there. We need to take things like the Millennium Development Goals. We need to take them on to the Sustainable Development Goals. We need the political ambition to take things forward. We need the business world in there, because the business world actually has many of the solutions. We need to release the power of the business world to be able to provide some of the solutions. But we also need you, each one of you, because you individually make choices every single day in terms of what you consume, what you buy, and the choices that you make. All impact together this sustainable world or lack of sustainability as we go forward. And so what I hope that I've sort of given to you is that, yes, this is a very big and a very broad subject, but I hope that we can particularly look forward. We know it's difficult. We know there are some challenges. But what we've got to be able to do, I think, a lot of this is around speed. It's around acceleration. It's about how do we make those choices around the solutions that we know exist in a way that is going to be more impactful, not just for the developed world, but critically also for the emerging world. Anyway, enough from me. I want to introduce you now to a person who I think probably has done more than anybody I know in the business world to actually try to put forward, I think, a very proactive case around sustainability. He's led from the front. He's developed a strategy around Unilever, which has put sustainability right at the heart of that commercial strategy. And I'm sure Paul will talk a bit more about that. He's been involved in the policy level. He's been involved in terms of defining some of the Sustainable Development Goals. He was involved this weekend in some of the big discussions around nutrition with David Cameron and the announcements there. And I think that what he's done in terms of trying to galvanise the leadership team at Unilever has been particularly impressive. And in many ways, I think it's a great privilege for us tonight to hear someone who's very much at the front end trying to sort of say, okay, how is it that we, from a business point of view, can really make a difference on the sustainability agenda? Because it matters. It matters from a business point of view. It matters because of trust. It matters because of transparency. And it matters because business needs to have a license to operate going forward. And so with that, I'm delighted to welcome Paul Polman as the CEO of Unilever. And let's give him a warm welcome. Paul, thanks very much for joining us.
I see Caroline there as well, so I wonder what you guys talk about at home, you know, because you're both so passionate about it. My wife is a musician, so she keeps me honest by introducing me to the world of art, and I was always glad to be in the modern Tate. And Nick, I didn't see Nick today, is he here? No. But we've been a long-term sponsor of the Tate series, the Unilever series, and the crack is still in the floor anytime you come into the turbine hall. And that will stay there forever, I think. So there's a proof. Here you have it. Anyway, as a Dutchman, they always tell you never follow an Englishman because somehow you guys are amazing speakers. And Mark is showing that again. He was just explaining to you all the things I wanted to talk about. So now, you know, I'm stuck. Either I repeat what he said, and I saw you all nodding, so you're convinced anyway. Or we spend a little bit of time on the questions and answers, and I'll just make it a little bit shorter here, and then we have a little bit more discussion. I was at the airport the other day, and I saw 3 people sitting there, and I listened in. I know it's very unpolite, but I'm sure you've done that as well. What are they talking about, you know? And quickly I found out that one of them was a doctor, the other one was an engineer, and the other one was an economist. And the doctor said, hey, we have the oldest profession in the world, because you go to the book of Genesis, and Eve came out of the ribs of Adam. That was probably the first successful operation that we did. And so we have the oldest profession. The engineer said, I don't think so. I think we have the oldest profession. Because when there was chaos, we created the universe, order. And engineers, you know, are the ones that create order out of chaos. And the economist said, I don't think so. I think we have the oldest profession because who created the chaos in the first place? So here we are. As Mark has eloquently told us for about 10 minutes, we have to clean up the mess that the economist left behind. When I finished in the Netherlands, my father, we didn't have much money. We had 6 children, but thanks to the government and all the other things, we could get a decent education. At least I hope it was decent. But when he gave me a little thing when I graduated, and it was a little porcelain thing that had in Dutch written on it, because I did my economy studies in those days, and it said, an economist is someone who doesn't know it either. And I didn't understand the meaning of it then. This was in '79, and I thought, why does the old man give me this and all that stuff? But I kept it in my desk. I've always kept it in my desk in my house. And when I open my drawer before I need something, I see the little plaque. He's long gone. But it is what we are. It keeps you a little humble. We don't have all the answers. We need to work together to solve some of these bigger problems. So I'll stand here with a certain level of humility to share with you what we are doing. But I will also tell you that the challenges that we have are bigger than we can solve alone. So this is not a Unilever story. This is a story of how we can ensure that we have a better future for all of us and our children and our grandchildren. And I don't care really if you work for business or not. Somehow I ended up in business. Believe it or not, I wanted to be a priest and I wanted to be a doctor. And then in Holland, both of these things, and not the priest side, but I abolished that because I discovered some other things. But the doctor side was with a lottery system in the Netherlands because they only have so many places. And then if you don't get in, you do something else. And so I ended up in economics at that time. And somehow that's how life goes. And then you stand here running a business and having the honor to do that. But first and foremost, we're all citizens of this world. And we have some responsibilities that go way beyond the small institutions that we represent. So I'm very glad that you do these series, and Michael and Nick, you should be congratulated on that with your Samin organization, or however you pronounce it. And I was just flipping through the book and seeing that Mary Robinson is coming next, and so you're able to attract quite some formidable speakers, and I feel a little guilty having our office across the street that I only am here at my own lecture, even knowing what I'm going to say, so it's kind of boring for me. But not being able to benefit from that, because a lot of people are critical of the G8 or the G20, and I've been involved in many of their activities. And the G8 itself, you shouldn't underestimate that, because whatever they are, they obviously shouldn't talk about the total world, and they have no right to. But at the same time, it's about 50% of the global economy. And if it's easier to get 8 people to agree, you'd think, than 195 people. And if you're half the economy, then you can do something good with it. And the same with the G20, which actually is probably about 90% of the world economy still. It's not right that it is 90%, but that's the reality. So you can create an enormous critical mass by leveraging them well. One of the things I had the honor to chair in one of my activities in life was to be the chairman of the Food Security Task Force for the B20 to help the people figure out how to solve the issue of food security. You know, it's absolutely ridiculous that we live in today's world where 870 million people go to bed hungry, not knowing if to wake up the next day. 1 every 6 seconds, a child dying still of hunger. Then we are able to waste about 30 to 40% of the food in between as if it doesn't count. And then we have on the other side 1.2 billion people obese and rapidly increasing, where the biggest epidemic now is epidemic disease, is obviously diabetes too. So there's something there that the most intelligent species in this world haven't figured out yet. That bothers me, and we ought to be able to solve that. And it's in everybody's interest, by the way. It takes nothing. It takes absolutely nothing to solve that. The numbers that we put out is 70 to 80 billion to solve the food crisis. In fact, 1% more food in the world given to the poorest people already solves the fact that they go to bed hungry or not. And that's why we had the summit here this weekend, and we were hosting that in our office. I'll talk about that a little bit later, but it's actually a very good thing. But what you're doing is right, because we've talked a lot with the UK government on how to exploit the fact that they're now chairing the G8. As you know, the previous ones were the US. And there are some things that actually are leading up to the G8. One is this nutrition and food security event that we had this weekend, which we called Nutrition for Growth. And in the afternoon, with all the heads of state of Africa, we had the new Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition. They're obviously closely linked. Then there's another event on science and innovation. It's very important. You need growth, you need progress. And that's obviously something that we need to develop even more in this part of the world. And then trade, tax, and transparency. Mark was saying you are not going to use the word tax in your talk, probably. MIM, you know, I'm not even starting the talk, and I've already used the word tax 3 times now. And I'll say it again as tax is 4th time, so you can. But it's very important that we talk about everybody contributing its fair share to society and also to solving issues there. But let's first start on a positive note, not to make this a doomsday scenario, because I'm actually an optimist. And I'm an optimist for different reasons, but one of them is that having the negative train of thought, which my mind has tried to force me in many times in life, I've always discovered doesn't lead to anything. And with the short time that we're on this earth, if we don't keep that positive attitude, I think that would be one of the main enablers to achieve the challenges that we have. Just the negative line of thought doesn't lead to anything. Doesn't mean you don't want to be realistic, but it doesn't lead to anything. The positive thing is that globalization that we've seen, the technology that has become available, the digitization of society and the connectivity has lifted an enormous amount of people out of poverty. In fact, in the last 30 years, about 500 million people. And indeed, as Mark is saying, if you look at some of the Millennium Development Goals, we have halved the number of people living on poverty. Below the $1 a day, now we're talking $1.25 a day. That's an enormous progress. In fact, many of us wouldn't be sitting here without that globalization. Child deaths have come down by about 30%. We were this weekend with Bill Gates here. If you look at some of the other things like malaria and all that, significant reductions under the Millennium Development Goals, 25-30% there as well. Record numbers of people in school, for the first time parity of boys and girls in school. There are a lot of things we can be proud of. But I think what happened in 2008, because of this interdependent world, I think it became so complex, if you want to keep it simple, that no one was even able to see the relationships anymore and the connectivity. And when everything was going well for us, stock markets were going up every year, house prices were going up, everybody thought every year I'm a little bit better, companies were making more profit without putting in significant efforts. Nobody asked themselves questions. Why should you? So when we thought that we were on a little bubble, it all of a sudden started to change our mindset of what we were doing. And what we were discovering was, yes, we were lifting enormous amounts of people out of poverty, no doubt about that. But we were doing that in an unsustainable way. We were doing that by ranking up enormous levels of government debt, enormous levels of private debt, and frankly, overconsumption. But more importantly, I think the main conclusion that we should come to is that we developed a system that was very good for few, but not for all. And a system where too many people are excluded from the participation or feel that they don't get their fair share will ultimately be rejected, just like cancer in your body. So these 1 billion people I talk about more or less that go to bed hungry, they're not happy about that. If you see that the bottom billion in society only consume 1% and the top 1.5 billion consume 70%, that's not a world that's in equilibrium. If you see that the 400 billionaires now have more of the GDP than India, that's not a world that's in equilibrium. So that's why you get these Occupy Wall Streets. That's why you get the Arab Springs. And increasingly, consumers, obviously, are able to voice their concerns, to connect themselves. This is where digitization is a very positive force. But if it only becomes negative energy of frustration because they're not participating, without an ability to find the solutions, then you'll have a major problem. And that you see happening in some parts of the world where you don't see a solution. So this is where we come in, because as a company, we just started to think a little bit about, these constraints that we have on this, what Mark called sustainability, on these planetary boundaries, is obviously limiting a lot of people improving their standards of life. It's the biggest concern in China, by the way, because China understands very well, if you talk to any Chinese person in government, that if they cannot keep their economy growing and lifting many Chinese out of poverty, they're not going to be there for a long time. So if they want to change their system, responsibly over time, they need to attack these planetary boundaries. I don't know if you saw it 2 or 3 weeks ago. You couldn't even see the other side of the street in Beijing. It was more than 400 particles in the air. And immediately you get an iPhone, it goes across the world, ooh, what have we done? And 2 days later, they have the most stringent car exhaustion standards in the world. So you see the power of people coming through every day. And in fact, you also see what the failure of acting responsibly is doing now, much quicker than before. Now, trust is low in society, we all know that. And often people like to say, oh, trust is low in business, or trust is this. But I was just thinking, coming here in the car, just looking at it for the last few months, and just let your memories go back a little bit over the last few months reading the FT or anything. We've had little children being molested by some religious faith. We have telephones hacked by some organizations. We have horse meat being fed in our mouths that people thought was something else. We have people that manipulated with our interest rates that we pay for mortgages by figuring out what the best LIBOR rate is for themselves. We've had governments or others that were filling in expense notes, making the taxpayers pay for things that were not there. Now, these things are always going on. Don't be naive about that. It's just that we have become a society that's far more transparent. These things are immediately in the public eye, and you can see it. And that accountability is aggregated now, or that is aggregated now and becomes much more transparent for everybody. And as a result, you've also seen that companies that are not behaving responsibly have seen enormous amounts of market cap wiped off very quickly. It only took 17 days in Egypt with this Arab Spring for a regime that was there 40 years, because consumers discovered that they could organize on Facebook with each other, they could communicate with each other on Twitter, they could show the world what they were doing on YouTube. The telephone has become a more powerful weapon in this world than the atomic bomb, believe me. So they were able to do that. If they can do that in 17 days in Egypt with a regime that was so ingrained, they can do that to companies in nanoseconds. It, to me, is so obvious. And sometimes I wonder why I have to explain that to people. So businesses have to realize, as much as anybody else, that they cannot just be bystanders in a system that gives them life in the first place. They have to become solution providers as much as anybody else, because they're equally part of these challenges that we're facing right now. I don't call them problems, notice that. I call them opportunities, but they're equally part of that. So they have to work together with governments, NGOs, to find a solution. Business cannot be a bystander in a system that gives them life in the first place. So what we did with Unilever was very easy. We said in Unilever, if we want to be in business for a long time to come, if we want to be successful, we just simply need to find a system that is more in sync with society, where your exposure is less, where you're actually contributing. When my parents grew up, I was born in 1956, but when my parents grew up, they were products of the Second World War. My father, I don't know if he could have gone to university or not, but he never went to university because of that. And it bothered him probably his whole life. He was determined that his children would go to university. The man worked 2 jobs to make that possible. They were also determined to be sure that we didn't have any wars in Europe anymore. We forget that. That's the reason why we have a European Union. Don't let yourself get sidetracked by other political soundbites now. But they worked for the common good. Somehow we forgot that. So why can't you make a business model like we want to live our lives? What's wrong with that? Because businesses are made up of individuals as well. And the business model is very simply, how can you give to society versus take? Wasn't that the origin of business in the first place? When we were all running around naked trying to hunt the animal, didn't we discover that being all hunter animals wasn't a good idea because some could walk faster than others, some were a little stronger than others? Didn't we decide that some were going to bake bread, others were going to make shoes, and others would get the meat for us? And we introduced some efficiency so that we could feed more people and all be better off? Wasn't business invented in its origins for the greater good? Wasn't Adam Smith, who's quoted so often, a professor of moral ethics? Have people forgotten that? He firmly believed that in any of these efforts to advance the cause of any individuals in their business community, the pressures of wanting to belong to would make them conform to the needs of overall society. That's basically what he said in his theory, and I'm sure many of you have read that. So we said very simply in Unilever, why don't we think about a business model where we give to society versus take? from society. It's the only thing. It's a small word, but it's a big thing. It's not easy to do, and it's not something you certainly can do alone. So our business model is one of doubling our turnover. Very energizing, but that doesn't get people out of bed. Don't be mistaken. Everybody who puts a big number on, you forget that's like a rallying cry. It is not something that motivates you. But the world is growing. There's 2 billion more people coming, many people lifting out of poverty. There's no reason why a company like ours cannot double. And we're well on our way to do that. But why don't we do that whilst at the same time reducing our overall environmental impact and improving our social impact? So we set ourselves 50 targets. All of our products, agriculturally based materials, we're a big food company. How can we source that sustainably? How can we create 500,000 jobs for smallhold farmers? And actually it's the women that you want to invest in, as Mark has said before. And how can we give 1 billion more people access to hygiene and well-being? Oh, might sound like a lot, but we happen to be a company where 2 billion people use us every day, and we happen to be a company that's in 7 out of 10 homes globally. So why not use that scale that is now possible to aggregate as a force for good? Now, we also said it will take 10 years because it's a thing that's not easy to do. And we also said we cannot do it alone. Some people were worried about that. 50 targets, how are you going to do this? No CEO is going to survive his job for 10 years, so that's nice of you to put something out there, and you don't have to deliver anyway. Sure, there were a lot of skeptics, because it's very easy to be skeptical. As I always say, skepticism is probably the lowest form of taking responsibility. But we did some things. We stopped giving guidance. We stopped doing quarterly reporting. We changed our compensation system for the long term. The first things we did, it was 5 years ago when I became CEO, is to create the right environment for people to behave the right way. The crisis of 2008, above all, was a crisis of morality. Not many people went to jail, but a lot of the loss of morality, the interest of the common good, the dignity of the individuals, those were the laws that were violated. So how do you create an environment around you so that people can behave the right way? And then obviously we put this business model out there. We also said we can't do it alone. And by saying we don't have all the answers, we can't do it alone, we actually showed some humility and actually some authenticity, whatever you want to call it. And all of a sudden a company, a big global multinational monster, becomes a little bit more open. And we said, why don't you come and help us? If you think we should all do this, we agree. We are there to the service of society. Why don't you help us on the journey? Instead of being only fixated on the endpoint, become part of the challenges of getting there. And that actually also changes the dynamics of NGOs. We had before that quite some NGOs climbing the buildings or trying to tell you to do this or that and dressing up like monkeys or gorillas or I don't know what. Any suit, I think, has paraded around our offices at one point or another. And now they're coming in and working with us together to see what we can do to make this a better world, and using the scale and size of a company like ours, sometimes to give an example, sometimes to give other people a little bit of courage, sometimes to be the tipping point. You know, there are only the top 100 companies in this world use about 15% of the world's resources. If you get these top 100 companies, for us that would be tea. We have 22% of the world tea supply with brands like Lipton, PG, Tips and all that stuff. So if you get companies like ours, you can really move the tea market to sustainable tea. Some other companies, palm oil, or happens to be us as well, but some other companies, other materials. So how do you get to these 100 companies and get them to, don't be fixated on the endpoint, be fixated on what it needs to get the tipping point. And that's amazing. If you look at, there is about 60,000 companies in the world that make up all the market cap of all the stock exchanges, believe it or not. Sounds low, but that's what it is. 600,000, I'm sorry, I said 60, 600,000 companies. But it's only the top 1,000 companies that account for more than half of that. Focus on those and help them do, So I've come to believe that you only need to get the coalitions of the right 20 to 30, whatever these coalitions are, to get to these tipping points. And it's in the interest of all of us to get these societies to function. If society doesn't function, business cannot function either. And business like ours like to be around for the long term, so you want to work on these longer term solutions. It sounds so obvious. Hard to do, but it sounds so obvious. So I give you 2 examples of how these coalitions are playing out and why I'm optimistic about that. And then I'll give you some of the things that we need to focus on. One of them is what we did this weekend, which is as we mentioned before, the Nutrition for Growth, or the New Alliance of Food Security and Nutrition. Two projects to really solve the issue of food security. All the heads of state were here from, or at least 12 heads of state from the African countries were in town this weekend. We had the governments here, we had NGOs here, the Bill Gateses of this world were here. Some of you might have seen him in Hyde Park with the IF campaign. And we spent the whole day, it happened to be in our offices because we were hosting that, in bringing people together. The issue of food security and sustainable sourcing, the smallhold farmer jobs you want to create, the capability building you need to do to train the women, etc. in Africa. Nobody can do that alone. In fact, if someone could have done that alone, the issue would already have been solved. A company like ours, even today, has to import 30 or 40% of its materials for the products we sell in Africa from outside of Africa. That can't be right. It's also not efficient. Why should an African in the Ivory Coast pay more for Flora or Blue Band margarine than someone in Rotterdam? Why should someone in Kinshasa pay more for Lifebuoy soap to wash their hands than someone in Brazil? So getting sourcing in Africa and supplying our products with the growth of the African continent and the potential sounds like a normal business thing. We also need to get the security of supply. How can we do that? By employing people in a continuous way. Then these communities grow. Isn't that, after all, what Henry Ford had as his starting principle? But we need governments to function. If you have corruption, you don't have rule of law, you don't have access to legal systems. If women don't have a right to participate and the society only pulls at 50% versus 100%, it's not going to work. If our truck gets 10 times stopped because someone wants corruption, it's not going to work either. But who's going to train these 50 or 100,000 smallhold farmers on a specific project? We don't have that capability. We would be bankrupt. So we need the Rainforest Alliance or Oxfam or any other ones to work with us. So it's these coalitions that get you to these solutions. This weekend, 4.1 billion was pledged just on the nutrition part alone, and 19 billion was pledged on issues like water and sanitation, to stop the 170 million children from being stunted, which, by the way, in some countries is about 10% of their global economy. Globally, 2 to 3%. It's a cost of the economy. We ought to worry about that, also as business people. It only takes 7 to 10 billion a year to solve that. Without any doubt, we spend 50 to 100 billion to bail out Greece. I don't say that's wrong. We have to do that, perhaps. But if we can spend 100 billion to bail out Greece, can't we spend the 7 to 10 billion to give everybody the minimum right of dignity, to have the right to food, or to have their brains developed to their fullest potential, like we all had? Isn't that the minimum we all have a responsibility for? And as we do this, we obviously also have more possibilities to sell our products. The other one is an alliance we created with the industry. So this is a case where the industry decides, by working together, it's better for all of us than not working together. Obviously within the competitive laws and all the rules and regulations that are out there. We created a global consumer goods forum, companies like Tesco's or Walmart's or Carrefour's, including companies, manufacturing companies like ours, or Kraft or Pepsi. It's about 3 trillion in consumer sales. These big companies went together and said, wouldn't it be right if we just take a very strong signal and say by 2020 we stop selling all products that comes from illegal deforestation? Illegal deforestation, half of it is driven by food. The need for soy, for beef, for palm oil. So the food supply companies like ours have to take some responsibility. But you can't do it alone. So we create this, send this signal, we want to do that. Then governments come on board. We want to be part of that. We now have the US government, the UK government, the Norwegians, the Dutch, the Indonesians. There's a big conference going in 3 weeks in Jakarta. Funds are coming in. Norway has paid 1 billion to help them with transitions. The World Bank is now coming in. I'm convinced that we can solve it for a great way by the timing we've set ourselves. Because we've taken the risk away from politicians. We've created these alliances of the right 30, if you want to call it that way, and you get to a tipping point. And that's a better business for all of us. Sustainable palm oil has a higher yield. Over time, it's a secure supply. The costs are lower. But who's going to pay for the training, the development, helping indigenous tribes, alternative things that need to be solved, That's why you need to work together. So these are very simple coalitions. I always like to quote Viktor Frankl, who wrote his book, Man's Search for Meaning, where he said very simply in his book, when they built the Statue of Liberty on the east coast of the United States, they forgot to build the Statue of Responsibility on the west coast. And he was right. You cannot run companies of this size or have this scale and this liberty to operate in all places in the world like we do, if you are not willing to take the responsibilities either, the core responsibilities. But it is also clear to all of us that the challenges that we face, the challenges of food security, water, access to energy, alleviation of poverty, maternal rights, and I could go on and on and on, that you cannot, these problems have been created. You cannot solve them in the same way as these problems have been created. It was Einstein who said the definition of insanity is to try to do the same thing over and over and expect different results. If we really want to solve these challenges, we also have to work at a different level. We have to work together across these coalitions. That's why you have a global compact that Mark is leading. We have 7,000 companies with the UN Global Compact. And many of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and many of these other organizations. Now, what is the biggest challenge? Look long term. I talked about that. The second challenge is to create these partnerships. You need trust. Well, Stephen Covey in his book 7 Habits of Effective Leaders, who said something very perceptive. He said, you cannot talk yourself out of things you've behaved yourself into. You cannot talk yourself out of things you've behaved yourself into. It's true with everything in life. It's also true with the way companies have behaved, or governments. So we have to work to build that trust that comes with transparency. And then you need something that is a very scarce commodity right now, which is courageous leadership. Because the forces against change will always be spending more and will be more focal because they have more to lose than the forces that benefit from change. And you need to be driven by an enormous sense of purpose. I'm sorry, am I messing up the whole thing? I'm getting too excited. And you need to be driven by an enormous sense of purpose to not get yourself be derailed. So it's about purpose. It's about that passion, if you want to. And it's about that partnership. And if you have those things together, I'm convinced that bringing the right people together, we can create this better future, not only for ourselves, but for many generations to come. And isn't that what life is all about? Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Paul, for that tour de force, racing through the Statue of Responsibility, Chinese air particle pollution standards, what else? The Arab Spring, horse meat, LIBOR, and tax, which we will mention later because you didn't get to talk about that. But you present me with a problem as a cynical journalist because I want to be really cynical, but you're infectiously enthusiastic about this. And it's affecting my cynicism, which I find to be a dangerous place to be. So I'm now going to make up for the fact that I'm being sucked into Planet Polman and be even more aggressive than I really want to be, because it sounds really cool what you're doing now. I'm just joking.
But you're still young, so that's okay.
Listen, I'm going to just fire 2 or 3 quick fire questions at you before we bring Mark in, about how this actually works on the ground. How it works, if you like, when push comes to shove, when you have to make a tough business decision. Because this sounds amazing, it sounds brilliant. But on the one hand, you're holding up the standard for many other giant companies around the world. So I'm sure they would want to know, seriously, the first thing, you mentioned this, how when you gave your new strategy, when you arrived on the scene and you gave your new strategic initiative, of which this was a key part, a central part, and part of that was telling your shareholders that you weren't going to give them, guidance quarterly, that this was they'd have to see this out, all this thing was going to work. How well did that go down at first? How convinced were they by this? And how applicable, therefore, is this approach across other large businesses that aren't doing this?
No, I think it is applicable to many businesses, and we're not the only ones. So don't make this. I don't want to make this a Unilever story alone, because there are many others. But the challenge we had with the two things I learned was, obviously, the one is not a surprise. When our business wasn't doing as well as it could have been doing when I came, I was the first CEO coming in from the outside. But I also thought there's only one window of opportunity to change things. And I've said before, my thinking was, the day they hire me, they can't fire me. So that's when I did it. But unfortunately, because the business results were not that strong, the first reaction of the market was, there must be something really bad that they're trying to tell us. And the stock price went down 8%, which gets you to this point. You can't talk yourself out of things you've behaved yourself into. Subsequently, our share price has been the best performer for the last 2 years in the Netherlands, the Dutch stock exchange, because we are a dually listed company. It has more than doubled. Because we don't do the quarterly reporting anymore, it saves me from explaining to people that Ramadan is a week earlier, or that the weather was bad for my ice cream, or that Easter fell, things that frankly I'm not very enthusiastic about spending too much time on. And people forget that the 90 days is minus the weekends is only 76 days. I mean, you go to bed, you wake up, and it's not a quarter. So our communications with the shareholders have become more strategic. That has allowed us to better think through our own communication with them, our strategies. We have spent a lot of time on attracting other shareholders. So I've also been sometimes too vocal. I wouldn't do that again, perhaps as much, but about what shareholders we want, and not to be driven by the shareholders itself. There are many shareholders out there, and if, as I believe, too many CEOs cater to the wishes of their shareholders, and then drive you nuts, because so many shareholders have so many different objectives in your business. So you need to be very strong with your own strategies. I found it's easier to get rid of shareholders than to attract new shareholders. Surprise, surprise. But at the end of the day, if you deliver, and you deliver consistently, your value will be reflected anyway. So we find ourselves in a good space now, where people understand what we're doing. And actually, shareholders understand that. People will tell you that. The companies that are ESG investors or impact investing is going up enormously. There's more and more evidence now that it has a higher chance of getting a better return. The questions at shareholder meetings now, I did a study the other day, 25% of the questions at shareholder meetings are related to sustainability things. We can now, with the internet, look at our websites and what people look at. It's not anymore the top and the bottom line, because they understand better than anybody else, as I was saying, that it's about risk management. It's about creating an environment where people can rise to their biggest challenge. It's about effective use of resources. Take this month. I can take every day, every week. But you have the Czechoslovakia flooding. You have the Turkey's turmoil. So last year alone, we reckoned all these things, from the droughts in the US to Hurricane Sandys to flooding here, and every week nearly, it cost us 300 to 400 million. By building into our business models a different thinking about the use of resources. All of our factories are zero waste. All of our energy is green energy. All these things save us well over 300 million. So by thinking about it, we can mitigate risk. And investors increasingly understand that. And then the last thing, which is not the most difficult to understand, is if you want to be a solution provider to some of the toughest challenges, you need to set the bar on innovation higher. Some of our fastest growing products right now are waterless shampoos, because a lot of people in parts of the world don't have access to water, or our bar soaps, or our Dove, where we have women's self-esteem. So every of our brands now has a more defined or a better defined social mission that obviously connects better with consumers, and as a result, you accelerate your growth. So you have to be able to want to walk that journey. And but what I found actually easier than I had thought was, if your purpose is strong enough, it's actually easier to align the organization than I thought.
Did you need fundamentally that space, though, from getting rid of the quarterly reporting?
It absolutely helps behavior. If you look at about 3 or 4 months ago, Roger Martin from the Rossum School wrote a book which was called Fixing the Game. It's actually worth reading. And what he tried to advocate is, don't have to support everything he's advocating, but what his thought there is we've basically become an expectation management society versus a reality society. The newspapers report if you miss versus guidance, or if you don't miss versus guidance. They don't talk about the actual thing anymore. There were some quarters that Unilever was growing 10%, but the market thought for some reason we would be growing 11%. Competition was growing 1 or 2%, but the headline will say Unilever misses market expectation. So we've become this expectation society versus the reality society. And he compares GE under Jack Welch, which was a great business leader. But when Jack retired, he said market shareholder value, alone in its isolation, shareholder value was probably the dumbest thing I did pursue. Unfortunately, he only discovered it after he retired. I don't know why it took so long. But of his 40 quarters, he had 40 quarters. He only missed 2 of them, and he only missed them by 1 penny. If he had 40 quarters where he hit the estimate, and only 2 of them he missed by a penny, he missed his vocation, because he should have been in Las Vegas. He would have made much more money. So the whole system, not surprising when he left, the share price went to half, and Jeff Immelt could clean up the mess. In the US, there was a study that Al Gore shared with me the other day, that 75% of the CEOs would postpone the right decision for their company if it meant that they would miss their quarterly guidance in the company. But think about that, how sad that is.
This town is built on shareholder value and guidance. And
I am not advocating abolishing shareholder value. I am saying that a business needs to go back to really focusing on its purpose in a responsible way. And if you do that, you will maximize shareholder value as well. If you maximize your value to society in a responsible way, shareholder value will also be maximized. But it is not the purpose of business. We did not go into business to build our share price to the highest levels. We go into business to serve a purpose. When Lord Lever invented in the 1870s or 1880s sunlight bar soap, it was because there was cholera in Britain, and 1 out of 2 babies didn't make it past year 1. That's why he invented it. He didn't invent it to maximize shareholder value.
So just lastly then, in this part of the chat, can you just describe a situation where you're round the board table where there's a bottom line to a business decision that you have changed because of the sustainability initiatives?
We, for example, said we want to go to sustainable palm oil, and by 2015 for ourselves. And the market wasn't totally ready for that, and we ended up buying 75% of the sustainable certificates, and that cost us about 15-20 million a year. And some people were saying, yeah, but we could save this 15-20 million by not buying sustainable certificates like all the other companies are doing. But then you don't help galvanize that system of change. And as a CEO, you have a responsibility, as I said, that comes with this size, to invest in some areas to galvanize that change, and then you make some savings in other areas. And as long as the total adds up, it's fine. That's how you manage your business anyway. How much do I invest in training? How much do I invest in IT? Those are all long-term decisions. How much do I invest in capital? Well, also start asking yourself, how much do you invest in some of these externalities? How much do you invest in living wages or social compliance in your supply chain? How much do you invest in paying some fair share of taxes in some places or another? How much do you invest? And if you make these decisions very balanced, when we run our factories on 0 waste, we save about $50 million a year for a company our size for not having to bring our products to the waste dump, or whatever you call it, to the landfill. So my thinking is, instead of saying here is 50 million more for your shareholders, which is very easy to do, you say here is 20 million more for your shareholders, and with the other 30, I prepare for an even better future so that the shareholders also have something for tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. So the compromises that you have to make are not as high as you think if you look at that holistically with the size of the business that we have.
So, Mark, when you look at that, how applicable is that model? I mean, Unilever is one of the biggest companies in the world. Mm-hmm. What lessons are there for the whole gamut of the world's biggest multinationals from that experience?
I would look at it at two levels. One is the external world, the other one's the internal world. If you look at the external world, I think one of the things that the Unilever is trying to do is look at its consumer proposition, which is it's trying to sort of present, if you like, sustainable products to consumers. And Paul talked about, for example, Dove, and it's about how you sort of, I think, build sustainability into your propositions. I think that is core as part of, if you like, being a responsible organisation going forward. I think the other dimension, which is really important, is that you can have people like Paul out there sort of preaching the word, if you like, but at the end of the day, if your organisation, your middle managers particularly don't get it, then you get a very different sort of internal alignment within the organisation. And so I think it's really important that as you understand, if you like, the power of sustainability, you have to bring your people along with you. And it's about not only making them aware, but it's about engagement and commitment. It's how do you get people in your organisation committed to understanding, if you like, there's real value in terms of not just the economic side of it, but also the environmental and the social side. And that, to me, is part of the trick here.
So that's quite interesting, particularly, as I say, in the town that we all seem to live in here. We know about how bonuses, very brutal monetary bonuses incentivized highly short-term and ultimately damaging behaviour. Can you actually factor this into the remuneration structures of middle management? Can you say, it doesn't matter if you don't make this financial target, but if you help increase the literacy rate, or I don't know how you do it. Has anyone managed to make that work?
Well, I think we're beginning to see that work. So a good example would be, let's suppose you're running a plant, and suppose it produces 100 tonnes of carbon per annum. If you can actually reduce that from 100 tonnes to 96 tonnes, there's some value in that. Yeah. You can provide some incentives. I think one of the things that's very important here is that actually we're not trying to, if you like, create something sustainability, which is aside from, I think, some of the economic realities. I think the more that you can get some of the alignment there, you get some real power in the motivation. And I think you can begin to get the right sort of performance metrics. If you look at it from the point of view of what are we trying to do at the corporate level, what are we trying to do at personal level, and how does that link back to your individual performance? It is ultimately a portfolio of approach. Not every company has done that, but I think certainly a number of companies are doing that. And if you look at some of your critical objectives, particularly around things like how do we reduce our carbon footprint, what are we doing in terms of some of the social impact? And you can look at a number of companies out there today, who are looking at the Global Reporting Initiative, who are trying to come up with a much more balanced scorecard approach. I think that's the entree into having a more balanced approach to performance management.
So how do you do that then? Do you actually give people alternatives to kind of stakeholder metrics?
Yeah, so a few things you touched on. First of all, on the compensation system. First of all, the stronger your purpose, the less you have to worry about your compensation system. I'm not an exception, but it's very seldom that I think about my salary. Then people say, yeah, because you're paid enough anyway. So I understand that. But if that drives you, you shouldn't have these jobs in the first place. And boards are smart enough to see that through. And I think it was Warren Buffett that said, when the waves come down, you can see who wears a swimming suit or not. And you see a lot of CEOs hooking off now because they're not able to live with the higher standards that are being put on society now. The debate that banks say, I cannot attract the right people when I don't pay them so much, is to me ludicrous. If you join Unilever, you get paid a good amount of money, but significantly less than the banks, and we are able to attract the best people in the world. We are in most places the preferred employer. It's because we have a deeper purpose. So what we do with our compensation system, which is equally important, is it has to be transparent, it has to be linked to performance. We changed our compensation system at all levels by having our short-term bonuses. You only get your long-term plans if you invest your short-term bonus, put your word where your mouth is, and then you have to hold it for a certain period of time. Things that I wish any of the financial sector would have looked at, but unfortunately nobody has come yet. So I think these things are very important for us. We are working now with Richard Branson and Jochem Seitz from Puma and others on what is called the B team, getting about 50 people there. Mohamed Yunus of the Rajan Tatas, Mary Robinson now, you can ask her when she's here. Day after tomorrow, she was with us this weekend, is how can we change the incentive system? How can we change the reporting that Mark is referring to? And how can we change the leadership that is required? On the reporting, I'm equally optimistic because here a lot of companies are starting to do carbon reporting. About a quarter of the big companies have sustainability reports. The companies that sign up to the UN Global Compact and the principles of the Global Compact that Mark is very capably leading, there is a movement there, obviously linked to that transparency, that is rapidly growing. But we have to figure out a way to count for things that we don't value currently. Currently, a dead tree is valued more than a live tree. That's not good. It's not good for this world. It's not good for the long term. So we are all capitalists. I'm not sitting here as a socialist or a communist. Don't misunderstand me. But a capitalist is probably best placed to optimize. But right now, we only have defined that as the return on capital. And that's what the profit and loss statement is and all that. But if you give social or environmental values a price, then a capitalist will be best placed to optimize that.
You see, this is the way that people kind of square the circle, as it were, of incentivizing multinationals to do good. You put a price on the externality and you solve it. I mean, I just wonder, and it's a nice, and everyone can smile and walk away from this, and everyone feels very happy. But, you know, we've got examples of that just totally failing already with the carbon trading market in Europe. It's a total failure.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And it's not everything we do is a success or the way that we want it. And it, again, boils down to what we were talking before. The world has become so interdependent that if we don't figure out a system that works for all of us, not just for a few. Also in Europe, you cannot have Europe do one thing and then lose its competitiveness, because then we're screaming again for unemployment. The European economy has gone down so much, so there is no need for these carbon credits because the production has gone down. So you have to be careful there about what these drivers are. But it shows you why you have to work together more on a global level to tackle some of these biggest challenges. There's absolutely no doubt about that. We don't disagree with you there. And that's obviously what we're trying to do.
I just wonder, you sort of manoeuvre, though, into an area of quite subjective moral judgments over matters that are political, as the head of a multinational. So, you know, some people care more about carbon efficiency, some others care more about hunger alleviation, and, you know, and in the glorious world, you just do the same policies and everything will be solved. Sometimes they come into conflict. And I just wonder how you begin to make those decisions when you're obviously not a politician. Maybe you have to become a kind of politician, but that must be a rather difficult place to be.
Well, the first thing is you don't have the right to tell others what to do. So that's why I say you have to work with a high level of humility. And that's why you have to work in partnership. There is not a day that goes by now, and I deliberately say a day, that I don't talk directly with one or another NGO or with people in the government. And what you try to do is to come together in defining solutions to things. But you have to be very careful that the size of your company or the scale or the visibility that you have doesn't give you the right to have the right answer. But it certainly is clear that we have to be part of those solutions. When jobs have to be created, business has to do that, unfortunately, in this world. That's the system that we still have figured out as the best thing that exists. When challenges of sustainable consumption or there still need to be products that deliver that, and businesses have a role to play there. So being part of that solution is what we're advocating. We are not there advocating our solution. That's not what I've said. That's not what I will ever say.
Mark, how does a good business, as it were, cope with the fact or deal with the fact that not all of these initiatives go in the same direction? Some of them require kind of acute and delicate political judgment. How do you begin? You know, one man's poverty alleviation is another man's kind of, you know, road building horror, I guess.
Well, I think what we can see is that there are a number of fairly important sort of pathways that you can sort of begin to map out. There are some things around, as I mentioned, around sort of economic development and education, things around sort of, I think carbon's very important, transport. So I think you can only look at it through the lens and the prism of where you're coming from as a business. And for example, I was out in Peru 3 weeks ago, a big discussion there about the role of mining, for example, in terms of what it's doing around sort of infrastructure supporting sort of local development there. So I think you just have to understand today, I think, context. Understand the context in which you're operating. I think Paul's been very good in emphasising things like you have to think about your responsibilities, your licence to operate within the context which you're given. If you're a mining company operating in Peru, you need to understand what is your social responsibility in that context. Yes, there is some aspects of how do you develop, for example, silver mines in Peru in a responsible way, but at the same time you also have to think about what does that mean in terms of environmental sort of adaptation, mitigation actions, what are you doing in terms of the social, what are you doing in terms of infrastructure. And I think the other critical thing is time frame. And I think what you have to do is think very carefully about what you're doing over the short term, medium term and long term. And I think one of the big challenges for business particularly is the medium term. It's quite easy to think about what you do in the short term. It's also easy to think about what's going to happen in the longer term. But it's how do you manage that medium term? And the reason why I think it's so important now to talk about the coalitions is because at the end of the day, you have to work with government, both central and local. You have to be working with civil society to work out what are the right ways to actually, I think, get the right actions in place to deliver across those three dimensions of economic, environment and social. So I think that's the way that I would look at it. But for me, I think one of my key messages today is post-2008, you have to understand context. And not enough people, I think, particularly in business, they've been too hunkered down, focusing on delivering to the bottom line and understanding the context of where we are and how we're operating and what it means to be responsible is, I think, what the name of the game is going forward.
See, so if I build on that, Mark, because with the tenure of a CEO being 3.5 years and the economy being as tough as it is, there's an enormous demand that pulls you down and also keep your head under the water instead of above the water for many of them. And whilst we actually need the opposite. So an encouragement or a giving of confidence is 10 times more important. One of the reasons that we work so much on the post-2015 Millennium Development Goals is to get to your question that you were just posing. The world is not that simple anymore that one issue can solve the world. It's become so interdependent. One of the good things about the Millennium Development Goals are it's an overall goal that is a morality that goes across the world to end poverty in all its forms, irreversibly. And then it has 12 specifically interrelated goals on how to do that. Water is linked to food, and food is again linked to energy, and energy is linked to education, and education is linked to maternal health. And so these Millennium Development Goals are in fact the moral framework that have been put together with all the countries to have a standard that every individual country cannot do anymore. And we're now in the process, because they finished by 2015, so we're now in the process to developing the next Millennium Development Goals. And what is absolutely key is that we as citizens ensure that the individual member states that are now starting to negotiate that don't water it down to the lowest common denominator as we've seen in Rio, but that we put all of our energy behind that to ensure that there is some courageous goal to change this world. This is a unique opportunity that we all have, and it comes together with the climate change agreements, and that's another benefit if we do this well.
So we're going to go to some questions in just a couple of minutes. I'm just, I discussed this with a friend that we had this kind of theory that many, and this is perhaps not the case with your company, but some of your colleagues in the FTSE 100 chief execs, they tend to alight upon climate change and carbon alleviation because it's measurable. There's almost like a tyranny of measurement because it's easy to measure. You go with that. It's a big tick. It's kind of less controversial. But some of the more difficult ethical issues, they can kind of afford to park. They call it greenwash, don't they? So I'm just going to try and pin you down on three kind of ethical issues that are currently vaguely in the news. Clearly, your Unilever, big brands, advertising. Branding and advertising is fundamentally about getting people to consume stuff that they may not need. Is there a way that a sustainable company will change the model of branding or advertising?
Yeah, well, first you have to change the word advertising and make that more communication. And the second thing you have to make consuming is not necessarily the right word either. So we are working with many of these things. But what we do with our brands is to be able you take, for example, the bar soap brands. In many of the emerging markets, in Africa, only 4% of people wash their hands after defecation or before they prepare food. As a result of that, many people die of infectious diseases. So you need to communicate how you do your hand washing and why you do that and create habits. So we spend a lot of money on hand washing campaigns in schools. That takes obviously a certain amount of time to make that a ritual and to get it ingrained. We have to specifically focus on schools and on girls teenage girls because they are the most influential in their families coming home again. We work that with governments. So you call it advertising or not, it is a very important thing to do. So how you spend your money is often we judge. See, the reality is, if I may be honest, 80% of the people in the world in one generation will live outside of Europe and the US. And we try to discuss all of this and try to solve all these problems from a European angle. If you work in the other 80%, where in fact most of the activity is now happening, people desperately are in need to connect and to communicate and to find out what these brands do and how they do that. And if you do that responsibly, you will grow. And you call it advertising or not, that doesn't matter to us. We spent quite a lot of money on Dove, spend that behind women's self-esteem. Only 4% of women in the world feel that they're beautiful, which this audience is obviously way above that. But there is not one girl, a teenage girl anymore, that wants to participate in a swimming class or anything, because anybody you see on television has a computer-doctored body that doesn't exist. There's not one normal face of a beauty star that is her real face. So Dove is about real people, real bodies, real feeling good about yourself, inner beauty, outer beauty. And not surprisingly, the Dove self-esteem campaign, had the latest campaign, Police Sketches it's called, had 170 million people watching it. It's the most, what you might call advertised, we don't spend any money behind it, but it's the most branded campaign. In fact, I forgot to show something. Can you give me 2 minutes? 3 minutes, or am I over time?
Yes, I've got a lot to go.
Why don't you look at this for 3 minutes, which I wanted to show during my talk, but in my enthusiasm and passion, I totally forgot about it. Can we show that?
I still have the tough questions. I'm not going to forget.
Well, look at this. Look at this first, and your question. Look at this first, and your question will be softer. But you have to look. I hope we can see it. He will call this advertising.
என் மகன் வளர்கிறான் உள்ளங்களிலே இன்பம் பெருகிட மனதில் நிறைகின்றான் தாயும் தந்தையும் விரும்புவதெல்லாம் ஒன்னேதானுங்க ஐயா ஒன்னேதானுங்க கண்ணுக்கு கண்ணான தான் பெத்த பிள்ளை துள்ளி விளையாடியே மனதை மகிழச் செய்யணுங்க மகிழச் செய்யணுங்க தெய்வம் தந்த செல்வமையா நான் பெற்ற செல்வமையா ஆரோக்கியமும் அறிவும் பெற்று வளர்ந்துட்டானையா மனம் மகிழ்ந்தோமையா நாமே மனம் மகிழ்ந்தோமையா இந்த மகிழ்ச்சியின் வேதனை எதுவும் மறந்திடும் ஐயா ஐயா நாளொரு மேனியும் பொழுதொரு வண்ணம் என் மகன் வளருகிறான் உள்ளங்களிலே இன்பம் பெருகிட மனதில் நிறைகின்றான்
मेरा बच्चा 5 साल का हो गया।
इतना सब 5 साल में कौन सी बड़ी बात है?
बड़ी बात है मैडम, ये गुंडापा का पहला बच्चा है जो 5 साल की उम्र तक पहुंचा है।
क्या?
your question?
I'm now trapped because I've been advised to go to other questions now, so it looked like I've wimped out. So I have an incentive to ask you a hard question. No, but we'll come back to the hard questions later. I think the hard questions will come from the audience, and then I'll come in behind.
You know, every time I see this, I still get a lump in my throat. My wife cries because this is what we do for a living. If every of the brands can become a cause for social good, you're in sync with society, you'll be very successful. And by the way, your shareholders as well. If you call this advertising or not, I don't care. But we now do in India, we have the perfect villages. We employ 70,000 Shakti ladies to distribute there. We give them water, health, sanitation, food, and we bring these ecosystems to life. That gives every child a chance. What's wrong with that?
Great. Okay, let's take some questions. The gentleman in the orange jumper just here, and there's a gentleman in the back with the blue jumper. So let's take two together. And just if you could identify yourself.
Great. Good evening. My name is William Wong. Just a general question for the panel and something more specific for Mr. Polman. How do we explain sustainability in jargon-free language to an 8-year-old? And I think this is critical because so many people outside here, if you're going to ask them, what's your view on sustainability? I bet most people say, what's that? And something more specific for Mr. Polman. You mentioned sustainable palm oil just now. Now, that being a critical resource in your supply chain, and we all know the plantations remain a serious threat to biodiversity. So how do you square that dilemma? Thanks very much.
Thanks, William. Just the gentleman at the back.
Edward Davey, Prince of Wales's office. Paul, thank you for your wonderful talk. A question, how can we get the CEOs of the major oil companies of the world to replicate the ethical leadership that you've so powerfully shown?
Oil of different descriptions. So why don't we talk, Paul, why don't you answer about palm oil and crude oil?
Yeah. You know, there are two groups in the world that you need to focus on. I'm absolutely passionate about the young, and I'm happy to be here and also see this young audience. Because in the emerging markets, this 80%, and perhaps that's the part of the world that you grew up in as well, I don't know. Where are you from originally?
I spent my childhood in Hong Kong.
Hong Kong. So you know what I'm talking about. But 80% of the population lives in these emerging markets. Half of that population is below 25 years old. They understand better than anybody else, that they're half today and 100% tomorrow. I was in Liberia with Mrs. Shirleaf as part of the high-level panel in Monrovia. 56% of the country is below 15 years old. You don't have to ask them what they think about their sustainability. What they think about sustainability is to have a job, to have food, to be sure they have it also tomorrow, and to not steal the resources that belong to others. And that universal concept is very well understood with people that live in a world of increasing scarcity, especially in that part of the world that you know. The people that we need to focus on are the young, they're digitally connected, they care about the future. And the other group is what I call the concerned caregivers, which are the mothers with children. Mothers understand it. That's why it's so important that you invest in women in everything you do. If you invest in agriculture and women, you get about 30% more productivity. They take the money home, they invest it in their kids and in nutrition on top of it. The guy, when he has some money, first stops by on the corner to celebrate the fact that he had some money. So absolutely important to focus on those two groups. And frankly, you have a very high return for any responsible business person and for any shareholder there as well. $1 invested in nutrition gives you $30 for society. Any businessman would love to have such a rate of return. The issue of palm oil and biodiversity is a very important thing because obviously illegal deforestation, the slash and burn techniques that are happening, the enormous demand that comes from China and India, we have to stop that. We have finally, because a lot of people look at then taxing and negative incentives, we finally convinced the government of India to lower the tax rate for sustainable palm oil. We're trying to do that here in the UK, in Europe, same thing. So that there's a positive incentive for that and helps change behavior. Politicians usually think that their role is to regulate and to tax. They are very uncomfortable with positive incentives. You call it marketing or not, with a consumer company, the best thing that works is positive incentive, not negative incentive. And we can do a lot more if there's positive incentive. We ran an experiment with a big apartment where everybody could see everybody's electricity bill. And all of a sudden they discovered that they were above the average, on the average or below the average. All the people who were above the average started cutting down on their electricity bill because they didn't want to be on the average. Just by making it public, positive incentive. So it's not easy to do, but it's a much better force than anything else. So on one of the high-level panel goals that we have now proposed, one of the 12 goals, is in fact biodiversity, which is a very important thing, obviously, for the equilibrium of this fragile Mother Earth. And that is exactly why we want to stop the illegal deforestation. Every year, half the size of the UK, 1 acre an hour, disappears still on illegal deforestation. And if we can, for that reason, stop this illegal deforestation, we bring these biodiversities back that you are talking about. It's probably the biggest thing we can do. And consumers, which we have not succeeded in, how can we make consumers value that let's say our margarine that is made for part with sustainable palm oil or our toilet soaps are worth more to them as they make these contributions. And that is still a big challenge. The best power is the power of the wallet.
And on the crude oil, on the oil major chief executives?
We have some very good executives in the major oil companies. I know that there is a lot of baggage and old tape, etc. But again, you need to have everybody. Energy is a very important thing in this world. And the demand for energy as the population grows goes up enormously. People cannot lift themselves out of poverty if they don't have access to energy either. So we need to obviously build more sustainable energy, and we make this energy more affordable. There are many subsidies going on right now. The biofuels, energy subsidies in this world, which are actually not even benefiting the poor. They're benefiting the question came from there. They're benefiting the middle class more. These perverse subsidies, if you would abolish those, like Nigeria is now trying to do, would actually save far more money than what you need to solve the food supply issue. So with the energy companies, we're looking at a lot of these subsidies and abolishing those, which is a good thing. All of the big energy companies have signed up to a major initiative from the UN, which is called Energy for All. How can you double the efficiency of the energy? How can you get a certain percentage of sustainable energy?
This is quite interesting.
So these are great initiatives.
Some of the NGOs won't back that at all, will they? Because in Nigeria, poverty will go up and people will be very angry. And
in fact, in Nigeria, it's proven as well that a lot of that is not benefiting the poor. That's why you have to be careful what you read and what the reality is. And I go quite often to Nigeria. And you talk with the finance minister negotiating, or you talk with the people on the ground, and you look how it works. It's quite different right now. So that whole system of the subsidies that has been created has resulted in a perverse behavior that doesn't benefit anybody except a few people.
Mark, do you want to come in on the oils and also try and explain sustainability to an 8-year-old?
Right, well, as a consultant, sort of trying to explain language to an 8-year-old is probably not my forte, but I do think that thinking about the young, the digital, is very important. I also think it's very important to think about, we haven't talked too much about those who are in cities versus those in the rural, and I think some of the issues, and if I was trying to appeal to an 8-year-old, I would be thinking a lot, for example, around the things that an 8-year-old sort of experiences, looking at the sort of the schooling, thinking about what type of, what's going on in the school. Do they have, for example, sort of any computers? Do they have a schoolroom? Do they have, what's the experience like? And then what happens in terms of what type of food they eat? What's happening in terms of their health? So I think you have to appeal to people at where they're at, in a language which they understand, cities versus rural, more developed, less developed. I was very struck, two things. If you looked at when the whole question came up with Mali, look at the average age of Mali. It's about 16. And we had, actually, last week, we had the UK ambassador from Mozambique here. And Mozambique, average age, 19. So it's not just the sort of half the population's under 27. There's some of these countries, it's really very, very sort of young. And we have to be able to work with those people in those situations, as well as working in sort of more well sort of heeled cities like London, Paris, but also looking at some of the more deprived areas as well. So I think you've got to be able to tailor the messages. That would be my sort of my key point there. I think on the energy side, that's a very important area because I think we've got to look very much at how we sort of reinvent the energy system going forward. There's lots of issues there about what do we do on the supply side around the sort of how we move to more low-cost energy, how do we sort of move in that sort of direction. But there's a lot that can be done in terms of, I think, how we help people to understand energy efficiency better. And there's a huge job to be done, I think, in terms of educating people about the costs of energy and how people can be more efficient in terms of the way they use energy going forward. And I know that's not exactly sort of totally in the province of the sort of chief executives, but if you look at what we need to do going forward, if by 2030 we're going to need 40% more energy because of the population growth, we have got to be able to convince people to use energy more wisely.
Let's bring in some more questions or points. Yes, there's a lady just there, and maybe the gentleman just in front as well after that. Yeah.
I was interested to know a little bit more about Unilever's expansion strategy. You said that emerging markets are one of the major means in which you are expanding. I was wondering how sustainable or responsible that is in terms of the economic growth of those markets that you're moving into. By bringing big Western brands into the market, are you in some ways restricting the competition for local SMEs to grow within those markets themselves?
Very good question. Just the gentleman in front, if you could. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, so my question is, to me it seems quite obvious that the traditional accountability structures of the private sector, public sector, and third sector are converging. And with that comes efficiency and collaboration and joint innovation, perhaps. But there's also a risk that it actually hurts accountability because everyone's working towards the same goal, but who is actually scrutinizing that direction and keeping people accountable other than perhaps hard metrics? Who's actually looking out much more broadly and keeping everyone else in check? And Faisal, for you perhaps as well, because I think the media is probably part of that machine as well today.
The chair does not answer questions. Okay, I'll think about that.
The question
Paul.
is, who keeps the media in check?
Yeah, we can come on to that later.
Because that's a valid discussion, I agree with you.
Yeah, for another time. So, Paul, on I've lost my train of thought. The whole notion of you going into these emerging markets, I mean, clearly Unilever's has a long history in these emerging markets, then probably not emerging markets for your company, but sort of drowning out or crowding out other indigenous businesses.
Yeah. There is not just one emerging market anymore, with the 80% of the world being outside of Europe and the US. There are many different markets in many different states of development, from fragile states or Africa to Latin America to many countries now, like Korea or whatever, that are very well developed, or increasingly big pockets of China. You take Shanghai, and you have economies that are better than any European country on average. So we have to be very careful with these definitions of emerging markets now. We have a long history in these emerging markets, because Unilever had at least its fortune, if you want to, of merging the Dutch and the Brits, which were probably two of the most formidable colonial powers. So we find ourselves in a situation that we have about 60% of our business in emerging markets. All of our growth is in emerging markets. By the end of this decade, if I like it or not, 75 to 80% of our business will be in the emerging markets, even if I would go to bed and wake up then. And obviously our presence there, which has been a long presence, we were the only company actually in India that never got nationalized. And it brings you back to the philosophy of the company that we just work for the long-term interest of every country that we're in. For us, a concept of being a Dutch or a UK company doesn't exist. My management team is from Zimbabwe to India to Latin America. It's probably the most diverse way of running a company. We run the world in 8 clusters. Our head office here is a very small building for a company our size. And we focus on doing what is right for the countries. Now, we have a strategy in which categories we want to compete in, which products. But those are all products that are basic necessities everywhere. People have hygiene needs. They have clean water needs. They have sanitation needs. Open defecation is 2.4 million people. So one of our goals is to build 400,000 toilets. There's nothing wrong with that. Everywhere in the world, people would like that dignity to be able to go to their own toilet. And then we happen to have sustainable toilet cleaners, then that's fine, because then they can keep it hygienically clean. It's not a problem with that. Bar soap is a universal need. So if there are local companies, often they might not have the technology or the skill, but over time as these companies actually develop, what you'll see is the same as here, that the toughest competitors, and rightfully so, which is good for the economy, is our local competitors. They're often more agile, they're closer to the consumer. There are more patents now being invented in China than in the US or anywhere else. So that competitive level, and that's actually good, because where brands can compete, we would advocate that, because where brands can compete, consumers are always better off. Where brands don't have the right to compete and consumers don't have choice, the consumer suffers. And that's universal, there's no exception.
Can I just, there's an allied question that I wanted to ask both of you, which is, there's a lot of pressure on Western so-called multinationals to do this stuff, but I do notice in the developing world that some of the local companies don't quite feel that same pressure on ethics. Are you seeing any difference? I mean, obviously Chinese multinationals, some of the Indian multinationals don't. Indian oil companies, for example, you'd never hear them going on or even pretending they cared about climate change and things like that. I just wonder if you reflect on that, whether you see that. Is it a disadvantage for you?
If the question is, if I may rephrase it, is if local companies have the same ethical standards as we do? Is that the question?
Yeah, more or less. Yeah.
More or less.
more.
That makes sense. What you find is in young emerging economies, institutions need to be built, the standards need to be set, and often it is the responsibility of companies like ours to help set those things. We cannot justify, I could never justify, that we treat a Chinese worker in a factory differently than an American worker or a French worker or a Bangladeshi worker. You can put cameras in all of our factories and we have the same equipment and the same way of working. And you can. And we actually just did a study with Oxfam on that because we want others to do that, not ourselves. So it is absolutely important that you have the same standards. The UK obviously has a bribery act, which we were way above that, but you're now liable if you have different behaviors in that respect in other countries, rightfully so. So we drive standards. In China, we produced the first green LED, they call it, factory. We have biomass for our energy in Hefei, and that has become a show factory for the Chinese authorities. Yeah, we invest a little bit more in there, but when China didn't have enough, or when they were surpassing the carbon emission standards, because Chinese are all engineers, they cut off the energy. The only factory that was running was our factory because it was on biomass. So increasingly people see that the way we do business makes a lot more sense. And you lift these standards up. If your question is, have you ever had a handicap by having these high standards in these countries versus the local competitor? My question is outright no, for businesses that want to be around for the long term.
Yes.
I'm just going to pick up one angle on that, because I think in the West we sometimes forget that actually we use the word branding as it relates to product, but in fact when you go to a lot of emerging markets, if I can use that word, particularly if you go to places like India, the employee brand, the company, is actually extremely important. It's the talent, if you like, dimension. And people are very concerned about where their children or where their family are working and the reputation of that company. And so I think that one of the things that we're actually learning in Western multinationals from a lot of the local companies is the importance of, if you like, the involvement with local community, the value of employee brand, as much as the value of market brand. And I think that's where, in fact, we've been actually, I think, in the West, learning a few lessons from what some of the local companies are doing. And I think this is part of actually understanding. Certainly the West hasn't got it all right. There are things that we can learn from emerging market multinationals just as, because in many ways they've been very close to their local markets. That's what's made them very successful.
Do you find, though, there was a classic example, and I won't name companies, but I'll name a industry type. I think that there was a study of car safety standards, for example, that showed that in Latin America and South America, the car safety standards were much lower, and people were dying from crashes they would not die of in Germany. I know of another.
And what happened after that study?
I don't know, actually.
That's the question.
I didn't follow up. And there's another example of mobile phone companies, famous ones, European ones, that in India. You can't prove this. I tried to prove it. they didn't know, but they know that a certain proportion of their custom can't read. And lo and behold, they get bombarded with nonsensical text messages, which they press the button, they get charged a rupee, and they're standing outside the phone walla saying, why have I got no credit left? And they say, because you keep on answering Bollywood trivia questions. And I mean, that's a serious example. But sorry, we couldn't do a story on that, and I won't name the company, but it strikes me that, yes, this is the good side of everything that you're describing, but there's a slightly darker side to all this, which is the differential treatment that some frankly, poorer countries get.
Where that is the case and the reasons are not justified, we should work hard to take them away. The same as in this part of the world, we still treat women and men differently. It's unacceptable. There's still the same, that we don't give the same access to education for everybody in this world, in this part of the world, is unacceptable. So when we see this, that is why I say the most important values are dignity for the individual, respect for the individual, and common good. So all the examples, wrong or right, is not really important to me. We should fight to take them away. Often, unfortunately, in some of these emerging markets, the rules, the laws, the regulations might not be totally there. The purchasing power might not be there. We put our standards on there because we have to write an article for the 9 o'clock deadline, and this sounds very interesting. So these things have reasons, but where it boils down to reasons that violate these two principles, we have to fight hard for that, absolutely. Yeah. But all of our products in these emerging markets are the same as what we sell here. Yeah. But we sell more products there without bells and whistles. So, because some people don't have that purchasing power. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, because as they climb up out of their misery, they'll be able to do more. That's a good thing.
So two quick points. One is, I think, inevitably...
Can we just try and address the really interesting point also about... this merger of accountability between the three different sectors. I find that fascinating.
Yeah, so 3 quick points. One is, I think you're going to get differences in standards in different parts of the world, but actually part of the benefits of economic interconnectedness is now we're actually sort of finding out where those differences are, and they're getting communicated much more quickly. So I think just be very aware of that. The second one, which I think is where the NGOs have a critical role, is capacity building, because certain countries just haven't got the capacity to be able to develop the infrastructure, the institutional frameworks. And I think we have a responsibility from policymakers through to business to really help sort of transmit sort of best practice. And I do think the convergence issue, which is this sort of bringing together of policymakers, business, NGOs in sort of collaborative ways, is really critical. And I think what Paul was pointing to, which I think is really the big opportunity, is that if you can start link the targets around particularly sustainable development goals, targets become the basis for accountability. And I think one of the reasons why the Millennium Development Goals were so successful was because they set some clear targets. You can disagree about the targets, but I think targets helping to clarify accountabilities. And if going forward from 2015 in the post-development era, we can get greater alignment between what we're trying to achieve at a global level around those sustainable development goals, link that to policy objectives and what I think business can achieve, I think that gives us a framework in which you can have meaningful collaboration across both the public, private and the civil society.
It's an interesting the question I find very fascinating, because in your sector maybe this line of accountability is clearer and easier, and some when you're helping people's sanitation, you're saving lives, that's not very controversial. If you take something like finance, if a big city bank goes into India and offers emancipating microcredit to all, but actually it's what we would call subprime in another circumstance. These are, and some argue that's exactly what happened in America. These ethical questions, these questions for accountability get much more difficult. I mean, I know we all want to, in this forum, talk about where everybody is on the same page and we can all just hold hands together and celebrate. But these are difficult ethical and political problems. And I just want you to talk about that a little bit.
No, absolutely, and I don't disagree with that. But I think we are entering in very good space with what we have talked a little bit about tonight, in terms of the transparency, in terms of the consumer power, that a lot of the things that would not live up to the standards that we expect everybody to behave in are much quicker exposed right now. That doesn't mean that there are individuals or institutions or whatever driven by other objectives. I don't disagree with you there. We are not, and certainly don't want to give you the impression that we are naive utopian hippies in Unilever. There's a real world out there. There's a real world out there. What we are only saying is, let's focus on making the force for good as big as we can, so that we get the others with it. And where we see trailers, because there are many free riders also in our industry, even in consumer goods, we try to put pressure on or publicly shame or work with consumer groups. We have no problem with that either, to see if we can get the right critical mass. And as a result, you drive it higher, you know.
So where you're working with an NGO, if that NGO spots something it doesn't like about your business and goes public with it, what would you do in that situation?
Depends on the NGO, obviously, because there are so many NGOs, and often they are very good NGOs, but there are also some that have mono issues or approaches that are not actually constructive for anybody to solve things. So it's like all your shareholders with different opinions. So you have to. It's a very broad question you're asking. Yeah. But what we do is we work with all of the major NGOs to try to solve the enormous issues that we have in front of us. We've created the Unilever Foundation not long ago, about 3 years ago, and we deliberately decided to take the World Food Programme. We supply about 20 million meals a year. Oxfam, Save the Children, PSI, and UNICEF, did I mention that? But so 5 of them, and we work with them on scalable programs, because we thought it's better to work with fewer NGOs, which is a difficult choice, but to scale things for real impact globally, leveraging the Unilever scale, than working with many NGOs. And there are some NGOs that are so absolutely passionate for some issue or another that unfortunately we don't want to, not that we don't want to, but we don't have that capacity to work with them now. So that's a difficult choice, but I think at the end we also only have 24 hours a day and limited resources.
Is there anyone from an NGO here who's worried about the kind of co-option or this borderline between corporations and NGOs? So let's take 2 questions on that line.
It's Andrew Ward from the Prince's Youth Business International. We're an NGO, and we're a global network of organisations in 40 countries helping young people set up in business, creating and jobs on average about 3.4 per entrepreneur. My question to you, Mr. Polman, I'm very pleased with the work that you're doing. It's extremely good, and particularly obviously in the hygiene and the nutrition and helping young people start a life. But we do have this major problem in the world, global problem, and that is youth unemployment. There are nearly 75 million young people aged 18 to 24 unemployed. And we've seen in the countries, as just even like Spain, what happens when young people don't have jobs. We're in a situation now that not only people haven't got a job, young people haven't got a job, they never had a job. And that's a big shift that we have to change. It's a challenge for us all around the world. So I really would welcome having the opportunity to converse with you at a later stage, how we can work as an NGO, a coalition with yourself, to make things happen. And I'm glad to see that Accenture and Barclays are 2 of our global partners. And I would hope that Unilever will be able to join that, because you're helping up to 2020, 500,000 farmers. Well, that's a great start, but it's only a start. I was recently in Kenya, and the youth unemployment there is 65%. It's 80% in Uganda. In these countries, yeah, fine. In Germany, yes, it's 7%. In this country, it's 20%. But the fact is that there are a lot of people in a lot of poor countries that need help, and the only way that can be done is within a local context, but with international support.
Well, why didn't you start answering that? And if you could just pass
the microphone
to the guy.
I'm nodding violently yes. I agree with that. You say 500,000 as a start, but don't set the bar at a level that we cannot deliver as a company. We're only one company. 500,000 new jobs being created in smallhold farming. Nobody has ever done that. I talk a lot with the Prince himself because I have great respect for the work the Prince's Trust does. We are involved in many projects in sustainable farming and other things. One of the big supporters of the Cambridge Institute. So all my respect, honestly, for all the efforts that you and him are doing. And the youth employment schemes here in the UK we're part of. The apprenticeship scheme we're part of. I just want to point out one thing that Europe needs to do. I stuck out my neck, and we had the first strike in the history of our company here in the UK. And people were saying, here you are, Unilever Sustainable Living Plan, wanting to improve the world, and you have your first strike because you're cutting pensions from people. Well, the Unilever employees are living longer than anybody else in this world. Their pensions were on the top 1% of the UK, and all we were asking was, why don't we do a little less so we can invest it in youth employment schemes? I thought that was quite normal. The unions are tremendously focused on preserving the status quo in Europe as well, which is protecting. That's why the 50-plus party in my country, the Netherlands. Netherlands is one of the fastest growing parties. Don't take away. So the transitions that we all need to make to help this major issue that is going on, that is a major concern to me as well, the youth and employment, especially in Southern Europe, yeah, we want to solve that, but we cannot solve that alone, but we want to be part of that solution. I went to Greece deliberately. I saw the Prime Minister. He was already happy to see a businessman because nobody's visiting him, except Brussels, to ask for more money. And you know, we have the leading olive oil brand there, the leading olive oil brand, and that's an ideal crop to create jobs, because these little islands, you cannot put a factory there for Europe. It's just not economical. Can't compete. But olive oil, you pick by hand, you can create a lot of jobs. So we have 15,000 Greek people working for us because of the olive oil. I said to him, why don't we sit together and see if we can create another 15,000? That's the type of discussion we need to have. And that is what the role of business is. But for that, he needs to put in perhaps not the tax system that he has currently to try to solve his other problems. He needs to help with export facilitation and other things. You need to do that together. Instead of saying, oh yeah, but that's only for Unilever's benefit and you make money on it and then we should do it. We're talking about lives of people. So I agree with what the Prince's Trust does. I agree with your quest on some of these terrible situations in Africa where I'm quite often myself as well. But in due respect, the 500,000 target that we have set ourselves, we currently even have a hard time reaching it because the capacity building on the ground isn't even there.
Gentleman over there.
Yeah. So I had a comment. Oh, sorry. I was already had the microphone. Yeah. And I had a comment or a reservation. You're just asking about reservations about NGO partnerships, and I've been working in one of the 5 that Paul just mentioned. I won't say which, but I do think there is a concern that when everybody is working together in a partnership, when funding streams begin to get mixed, when friendships begin to get developed, I do worry about who's placed to take the critical positions and go out on the line and criticise what needs to be criticised. So that's the reservation I'd express. And I also had a question, which was just, I found it striking that Paul Polman began by talking about growth, by talking about sustainability while doubling turnover. And I wondered if Unilever had managed to get to the point where they questioned the priority on growth.
The what?
Priority on growth.
On growth.
On growth. Yeah. If you can just bring the thing down to just here, the microphone. But Paul, do you want to take? Well, why don't you take on the?
Let me just make one point about sort of NGO collaboration issue. I think it's very important that if you come back to a lot of the sustainability, it's about scaling, it's about acceleration, it's about finding best practice. And one of the things that Paul mentioned is that we waste an incredible amount of food in the food chain. And I've seen a fantastic example of where a comms company, an NGO, and a fertilizer company essentially have been working together to help farmers in East Africa understand better what are the prices for their food and for their products, and therefore be able to help them take product to market and eliminate some of the waste. And that is a really good example of where I think sector collaboration has worked very effectively. And I think as we go forward, what we have to be able to do is highlight examples of like that of best practice, and then really be able to sort of see how we can scale that more broadly. So how do you take that model and take it to India, or take it to a Bangladesh, or take it somewhere else? So that, I think, is part of what we've got to try and do. And obviously where we find things not working so well, then try and make sure that we learn some of the lessons from it. But I think a lot of the way to scaling is by being able to really be clear about where best practice, where things work, why they work, and then being able to move it forward.
And just if you want to answer those points.
We could not work with NGOs if they were not critical. That doesn't interest me, because if we all become like-minded because one feeds the other, etc., then you defeat the purpose of reason for being. So that's very important that we keep that alive, because the NGOs are aggregations of citizens. And if they are responsible on that, we want that critical voice. We are now working on the debate on what is living wage and what are social compliance standards in the value chain. I cannot solve that myself. I don't have any idea on that topic. But working with several NGOs, challenging us, pushing these boundaries, and we actually perhaps running a little bit faster or farther than we otherwise would, is a very important thing for us to stay alive. So, and on top of that, for that reason, for example, one of the WWFs or others, we give limited funding, because we want these NGOs to find their funding by what they do, but then we work together on the projects. And the money goes to achieving what we are trying to achieve. And we do that not because we're mean and lean, but we do that to help the NGOs maintain their role that you rightfully say they have to play. That's a very important point that you bring up there. On the second point on growth and long term, just coming back to the gentleman from the Prince's Trust, who's going to solve the unemployment? If you now ask where everybody's concerned, not only CEOs, but everybody in society, including the young people from all the research that we do and others do, a job is the first thing they're worried about. And for that, you need to create opportunities to have a job, and that is growth. You go into the emerging markets, and you see the same thing. You see an enormous desire to improve their standards of life, and for that is growth. We have to define growth slightly differently than just GDP. In the same discussion as the P&L versus SPNL or EPNL, environmental accounting or social accounting, we also need to have a broader definition of GDP, and it's starting to happen. Where education is part of that, where pollution or absence of pollution is part of that, where quality of life factors, the GDP measure is really a too narrow measure there as well. But ultimately you need growth to create the jobs. 200 million unemployed now, 250 million jobs more need to be created in the next 10 years. But the growth, and this is also what we put in the report for the high-level panel, has to be sustainable and has to be more equitable. So we call it inclusive in the report. So the way we grow has to change. Now, there is no problem growing, and people then say, yeah, but where are all these resources coming from, and how do you do that? This is exactly why I tell you in our model, we need to decouple that growth from environmental impact. We are consuming more music now than ever. We had the big records, then it became the CDs. I thought that's the end of it, because nobody can invent something better. Now all the music is digital. We've created an ability to consume, if you call it that way, or to enjoy at a higher quality of noise than ever before and access than ever before, yet the stress on the Earth's scarce resources are less. It's a great example.
Just
yeah. Thank you. I'm Tanya Barron from Plan International UK.
Good.
And I very much liked your last question. It was a great invitation to those of us who are NGOs. We work very closely with Barclays on a big program. We've just got over 500,000 people into village savings. And it's a great thing to have these corporate civil society partnerships. There are ways in which I think the NGO world is becoming more business-like, and that's a good thing. But there are also special things that we can bring to the table. And for us in this project, we're all to do with village savings for young people to start their own small business startups. And we bring the young people, because that's what we're good at. So Barclays are helping people who are unbanked to have access to banks. And we are very good at bringing young people. So we'll have at least 100,000 of those people will be people under the age of 25.
That's very good. Thanks for sharing.
There's a yes.
Hi.
Can we be quite quick? We've only got 2 or 3 minutes left.
It will be very quick, because I was also Graham Randalls from the New Economics Foundation. I was also going to ask the growth question. Perhaps you could explain, Paul. It's been very inspirational so far, but how can you create the innovation to create jobs, create the kind of growth you're talking about, and reduce the environmental impact that you're talking about in Western countries where that's much more of a problem, and the problem is overconsumption?
Okay, we'll just take another couple. Have you got the mic? Yes, okay.
I would like to ask about the UN Global Compact. Will this work? Because it's not legally binding. Yeah, big companies like Google don't even pretend to pay lip service to it. So how is this realistic? Will it work?
Good question. And there was just another one down here. And if you make it quick, we'll then go to the lady as well. So
Thank you. Paul, I really enjoyed your talk. I think it was brilliant. You talked a lot about the Alliance for Food Security. I'm here. But I have read today a fair bit of criticism already of this partnership and some comments that some countries are not signing up to it, partly from likes of Friends of the Earth, Grain, and George Monbiot's columns just come out. Criticism based on things around it not really allowing seed sharing, for example, in Mozambique. Some comment around liberalisation of land deals in Ethiopia, and that running counter to recommendations, including from the Committee for Food Security, which you mentioned you'd been involved in. So I'd be really interested to hear your response to that, because that upsets me a bit, because it sounds like it's a good progress, but then some quite good people saying not.
No, it would be.
Quick comment from over here.
Yeah, I actually read the Friends of the Earth article also just coming over here, so just good that you mentioned that.
Very quick one. Thank you very much. I found it really inspirational. In terms of positive incentives, thinking about the post-2015 goals, how's the panel suggesting that we work together to ensure that the nation-states do sign up to some very positive targets?
Okay, so how do we split this up? UN Global Compact and the post-2015 goals. Mark, and final comments.
Okay, I think UN Global Compact, again, it's a lot of it's about peer pressure. I think that's very important. Paul mentioned the point about the coalitions of the willing, and I think actually the real issue here is leadership. I think the challenge around a lot of sustainability in companies is that you've got a lot of chief executives who actually say sustainability really matters. The key issue is execution, and we really need to hold them to the fire on execution. But I keep coming back, good best practice, good examples becomes very, I think, important in that world. I also think, another subject, but I really think there's some genuine competitive advantages that you can gain by being responsible, environmental, and I think there's an opportunity to really demonstrate leadership in that sort of context. That I think also links into the point about where are we going on the sort of the environmental, the SDGs. I think it's a critical sort of stage that we're at. This is a decade of transition, in my opinion. I think, again, it's very important. No one country can drive this on its own. So I think it's very important to look for sort of coalitions again around sort of political leadership. No reason, in my opinion, why we can't be, I think, reasonably ambitious. But what I would say to all of you is that you've all got a role to play as well. This is all about sort of, yes, macro, big stuff, SDGs and what's happening on the political, but you can still sort of, all the digital empowerment, you can still play a role. So I would encourage you to sort of, if you feel strongly about it, get in there, send the messages, make sure it happens. And I'll just say one point over here. I do think innovation in the environmental space is absolutely key. We haven't perhaps talked enough about that, but I do think there's a fantastic opportunity sort of going forward. If you look at the speed and scale at which things are moving, I think the opportunity for business to continue to innovate, whether it's through at the customer end, whether it's the environmental technology, all of those are very important. Thanks.
Okay, Mark down here has said, please come on to the talk on Wednesday and we can talk about the UN Global Compact a lot more. Okay, just want to pass that on. Any other messages? Our tweets? I'm very right. Okay, so we have a philosophical.
You know, the key thing on the post-development goal is probably the most important question, because, and I'm thinking a little bit and writing down, and I was just looking at my BlackBerry to get some information, because we have a window of 2 years, and now we have the open working group on the SDGs, because unfortunately we are on a trajectory from Rio where you have the MDG high-level panel that I was member of. David Cameron was a co-chair with President Yudi Ono and Mrs. Sirleaf. We produced a fairly courageous report that was overall well received, although 10% had the same comments as what you're now referring to, but that's the world we live in. But overall well received. And now we need to be very clear that this is what the world wants. We had 500,000 people that reached out, and many millions more, because they were represented by organizations from ActionAid to PSI to the young organization to you all. So we need to capitalize on that. So one of the things we are trying to see is, can we form the networks of the young? There is Nick Hartley here in the UK with the Reckless organization. There's the Young African Movement, which has been incredibly focal. We're going to South Africa with in 2 months' time, Desmond Tutu, Bono, others on the One Young World, and really see if we can use the young to keep pressure on, because the politicians even today might not be there tomorrow. So you have to do that. There is the website we've created, The World We Want. We want people to participate. In September, we have the big event coming up in New York, which is very important. The Global Compact will be there as well, focusing on the Millennium Development Goals, looking at Africa specifically. Yesterday, I was talking to David and Justin Greening on to see that we have this event that we organized, and the reason we got involved was to be sure that it was organized, that we maintain a few events between now and 2015. So that activity system is very important. And then we're working with, unfortunately I have to use the word as we end this thing, with an advertising agency to see how we can communicate and reach the people to aggregate and create that momentum. And we are happy to spend money on that. And that is what we call advertising. And we're proud of that. So that is what we do for a living.
And just on the specific point made by Amy about the seed.
Yeah, the Friends of the Earth and all that stuff. So it's like in anything. In Holland, you say, you say where there's smoke, there's fire, or you know. But the way we need to do it is very important, and we're very mindful of that in terms of land rights, women. Sustainable agriculture, issues of biofuel, preferred subsidies, it's not that easy. Issues of seed rights, they are coming up in every article. So everybody understands that. To not show up, to not participate, then to have your blog out with all the things, to me, is not acceptable. We are there trying to find compromises to feed the world. We have 12 heads of state coming in who spent not only the weekend, but 1 or 2 days around that. We have 4.1 billion of pledges, a lot from the European Union, by the way, that we want to put to good use in a responsible way together. You can continue to write these blogs, but fortunately what I've discovered with the web is it's easy to Google these blogs and come out on your desk. But the web is now a more sensible system of self-editing and auditing to increasingly make that the voice of the minority. So you have to be very careful. So I say to these people, with due respect, come join us with practical solutions. Practical is a big word on that. And I think on the innovation, really quickly, what we do on our innovation funnel is all of our brands now have a social mission. We are not there yet, but we want all of our brands. My goal is in life is not that, but my vision is that every brand has 1 billion fans that are a movement for change. Just like Lifebuoy is a movement for hand washing and hygiene. Or Dove is a movement for women's self-esteem. If all these brands are a movement of a good cause, these brands will do well. I'm actually not worried about that. So how do you create these positive movements? So every brand has a social mission and is part of a movement that belongs to the broader society. You have to steer it. In our innovation programs, we look at everything through a green funnel, we call it. We take the responsibility of the total supply chain. So, for example, from agriculture to sustainable living. We call it sustainable sourcing to sustainable living. Don't forget about our factories and our travel and our offices. They're important, but we do more than any annual report. But unfortunately, it's only a small impact. So if we can get people to take less showers or cook differently or work differently on the water uses in their homes, we have a much bigger impact than we can all do ourselves. So we work with our innovation programs, our communication programs to look at a total value chain impact. And our plan that we've put out, which makes it a little bit unique in that sense, when we talk about total decoupling, we talk about total decoupling for the world, not just, you know, what we can control and make these numbers sound big. So every hour of our activity systems, our reward systems, our measurement systems are geared towards that. But only on activities that drive our growth. But because we don't have to compromise on that. There's no need to compromise. And that's what people sometimes don't understand. Also, only when it's really profitable. Not really profitable in the big sense, but profitable in the sense of keeping it sustainable. Because our profits, which we are very proud of, by the way, which have not increased that much since I'm CEO, The growth has, but the profits have more or less stayed the same. Share price has doubled, by the way, so someone doesn't seem to care that much about making it too big. But all of our profits, that people don't understand, only go to two things in Unilever. We pay dividends, but that's the pension of a lot of people. It's the pension of millions of people. We provide that. Well, it doesn't come from government. They don't create anything. They redistribute it. And the other part of our money goes to building the factories. We built now 30 factories in the emerging markets to give people more access to our products. We have grown 10 billion turnover in the last 3.5 years. 10 billion turnover in a part of the world where people have 1 rupee or 1 RMB is 10 cents or 25 cents. Those are the 10 billion turnover are 30 to 40 billion acts of purchase of people who don't have any money, who have decided to depart with their scarce, hard-earned money, often spending 70-80% of their income on these type of products, and they have chosen by themselves to buy ours. Because the solutions that were provided were better than anybody else could provide them, including their governments. And that's why we built the 30 factories, and we will continue to build the 30 factories. And that's where the money goes. And in our accounting system, that has to come out of profit. So be it. Call it whatever you want. But that is the other part of sustainability that we don't need to be ashamed of and have to be able to confront people with and educate people on, including the French, by the way, but that's a separate story. Thank you very much.
We'll get on to that another time. Well, listen, obviously Jon Snow would never have let this go 10 minutes over. So that's another reason for regret for Jon's absence. I mean, I'll just take that question about the media on and answer it head on, which is, yeah, frankly, I don't think that we take these types of issues, given the interest and importance, not just at high-level governments, multinationals, but also amongst the youth and the young. We don't take these on enough, and maybe it's because cynically there isn't enough of an angle and a story. But the beauty of social media is all of you here can make this stuff really important. It is amazing how much, if all of you tweeted at a boss at Channel 4, why don't we have a special program about social enterprise business? What impact that would have? I'll tell you, this stuff has and one last little anecdote.
Creating a movement.
One of Paul's. I do know that one of Paul's fellow FTSE chief executives. Literally, if anything, I'll tell you now, it's Barclays. If you tweet anything at Barclays, it comes up in his room, right? And so you could actually have some fun with that one day. Shall we say that is absolutely true? So what I'm saying is, it's in your hands. But we, the media needs to step up as well, and we can change these things. But listen, I just wanted to thank Mark Spelman for introducing the discussion and contributing so much, and I wanted to thank Paul Polman for his time, for his extra time, 11 minutes extra time as well, than was offered. Fascinating insight into how a big business deals with being a corporate citizen in the 21st century. And we wish you luck in helping to create a better world and try and inspire more of your colleagues in other businesses to do the same. Thanks, both of you, for a fascinating evening. Thanks to Zameen as well for organising it. Thanks for you all for coming. Cheers.